Hello and welcome to Unit 4 Opener number 8. We're going to be talking about how to solve some equations that involve x squared, and also we'll be talking about some equations that involve the absolute value of x. So let's just start with this first one. X squared equals 36. I think most people know that in order to undo something squared, you would have to do the square root. So we'll do the square root on both sides, and it's pretty simple then to come back here and say, oh yeah, so x has to be equal to 6. One thing you have to remember though is that 6 is not the only number that you can square and get 36. Another number, which when it is squared gives you 36, is negative 6. So when you square root both sides of an equation, you could get the positive and you could get the negative number. We'll come back and see another way to think about this in just a minute. So one way people keep track of this, though, is when they write that square root on both sides, they put a positive and a negative in front so that they don't forget. It could be positive 6, could be negative 6. Okay, well, let's look at this second problem now. This is an absolute value equation. And it just says that the absolute value of x equals 5. In other words, this is saying that the distance from 0 to x on a number line is 5. So if we think about a number line, and if 0 is right here on the number line, if we go 5 units in this direction, then this distance comes out to be 5, and of course we end up at the number 5. But also we could go in the other direction, and if you go 5 units to the left, we'll end up at negative 5. So it's sort of the same idea here, that if the absolute value of x is equal to 5, then x itself could be equal to 5 or to negative 5. Let me just jump back now to problem A for a moment and point out that when you square root something that's being squared, like we did here, the square root of x squared, what you really end up getting is the absolute value of x equals the square root of the other side. So here's a different way to think of it. When you're square rooting x squared, you don't just get x. You get the absolute value of x. And so the absolute value of x is equal to 6, and therefore the values of x could be 6 or could be negative 6. So you can also think of it that way. When you square root something that's being squared, you end up with the absolute value of that thing, in this case x. Okay, well, let's keep going and look at these next two. The first one is x squared equals negative 6. So if we think about square rooting on both sides, we would get that the absolute value of x is equal to the square root of 6. Now, I don't know what the square root of 6 is off the top of my head, and if you wanted to, you could get out a calculator and you could punch in square root of 6 and you could get a decimal approximation, but I don't really think that's necessary. I think all that is necessary is to realize that if the absolute value of x equals the square root of 6, that means x could be the positive or the negative square root of 6. And if you want to write those two things out separately, square root of 6 or negative the square root of 6, that's fine too. But I like this nice compact way to write it. Okay, and now the last problem here, 2x absolute value equals 5. In order to remove this absolute value sign, we need to think again about distances from 0. So we know that the absolute value of 2x equals 5. Well, that means you could go 5 this way, or you could go 5 this way from 0. Now, of course, if you go to the left, that puts you at negative 5, not at positive 5. And we also know that this distance of 5 in either direction is equal to 2x. So we're going to come down here and we're actually going to write two different equations, just like we did above. Above, they were very simple equations, x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. Well, here it's going to be 2x equals 5. So that's saying the distance away from 0 to the right, or 2x equals negative 5, and that's going in the other direction. And now we just have to solve these two equations separately. So to get the x by itself, since it's multiplying by 2, I'm going to divide both sides by 2 and get x equals 5 halves. 4 divide by 2 on both sides here, x equals negative 5/2. Alright, so the big idea here is that when you're solving a quadratic or an absolute value, or other types of equations as well, there may be more than one solution for x that make the equation true. And in the case of x being squared, you have to remember that when you're square rooting that quantity squared, you end up with the absolute value of that quantity. And when we're solving absolute value problems, we need to remember that there are two different directions on the number line you can go from 0. So in order to get rid of those absolute value signs, you need to write two separate equations. One has the positive and one has the negative.